You. So yeah, delighted to be here, and thank you to the Green Foundation Ireland for the invitation. I must say, I didn't know that much about Green Foundation Ireland until an email came into my inbox a couple of weeks ago, and I did go kind of like thinking, okay, who is Green Foundation Ireland? What do they do? And I have to tell you, I was really impressed. I looked through the website. I must say I haven't listened to all of the recordings or seen all of the videos that are there, but the diversity of what you're doing, the content of what you're doing. So yeah, super. I'm looking forward to delving in a little bit more into the future. So yeah, delighted to be here. As Claire said, I'm inviting questions and comments as we go. And if you could, in the first instance, put them into the chat space, that would be great. And maybe if I could ask Claire or Anne or anyone else indeed, if I'm missing them, so if during my kind of remarks I'm not seeing what's happening in the chat space, feel free to just jump in and let me know. It's certainly not out of purposely avoiding the questions, not at all. But like at the very minimum, even if there weren't questions as we go, we will make sure towards the end of the session that there is time allotted for a general kind of conversation about the Sustainable Development Goals. I do want to mention just at the outset that I'm not here this evening to try to sell the Sustainable Development Goals to you. And I know they're not perfect. And I'm going to mention a couple of issues that personally I have with some of them as well as we go. But I also think that they are important. And I think you can hold both thoughts at the same time. You can have a kind of a critical analysis of the goals and also realize that they are important. And I'll try to speak to both of those points as we go. So if you don't mind, we'll get stuck in. I'm going to share the slides, of course, with Green Foundation Ireland afterwards, so you can have a copy of everything that you see. It's not heavy on the slides. I'm going to try and purposely use them just really as a reference point rather than a verbatim, talk as we go through them. And but as I say, if you do have questions as we go, then just stop me. So I'm just going to just put this into slide show just for a second. Yeah, so hopefully you can see that okay. I should say that the organization that I work with, Development Perspectives, you see the website address there. I will be sharing some resources from that website, but I would encourage any of you that wish to either drop me an email after the session if you have any queries about what it is I'm referring to, or any of the references that I'm referring to, or indeed if there's any further information that any of you would like to delve into, I'd be more than happy to get back to you via email. And when thinking about tonight's session, I really felt that we're at a kind of strange phase of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'll talk about the duration of them, 15 years that they're supposed to be in place. But here we are, 2023, and I kind of think that untapped potential is where we're at. We're kind of more than halfway through the timeline for the SDGs. So that's really kind of the kind of tagline for tonight's sessions, the Sustainable Development Goals 2023. So I am not here to sell, again, Development Perspectives to you, but I think it's important to position our involvement with the Sustainable Development Goals and my knowledge of the Sustainable Development Goals into the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. So Development Perspectives is a global citizenship education NGO, which used to be in Ireland termed as development education. I wouldn't get too caught up in the terminology around it, but essentially what we do is we work specifically with the adult and community education sector. So groups like yourselves and other groups across the country, but we also work, internationally with partners in Europe, and also then with partners outside of the European side of things. So Tanzania, Liberia, and Vietnam would be three places that we have strong partnerships. Our vision is to live in an equitable, just, and sustainable world. And no doubt that resonates with many people here this evening in terms of values, probably especially on the sustainable end of things, but no doubt there's huge crossover around equality and justice more generally. And our mission more specifically is to tackle poverty, inequality, and climate change through transformative education and active global citizenship. And probably all of you are examples of active global citizens. But the transformative education piece is something that we can maybe refer to a little bit later on. It's especially prevalent, I think, with adults, because it's not just learning from a head point of view. So I suppose that would be more got to do with the logical part of how we think and how we process information, but also the heart, how we feel about things, the emotional end of things, and the skills end of things as well. The hands, trying to do things. And again, some of the Green Foundation Ireland kind of talks on the website refer to a lot of that. And that could be about gardening, food production. There's a whole range of things that you would probably know far more about than I would around those skills end of things. So that's just a little bit of where I'm coming from. And I suppose, I think it's no harm, before we get stuck into the talk around the Sustainable Development Goals, I'm going to ask you a question, but for two reasons. One, I won't be explicit about. Well, I'll come back to that, the second one. But can I ask you what the biggest issue is in your community? So if you don't mind, in the chat space, could you enter into the chat space, just in a few words, what you feel is the most important issue in your community? And of course, feel free to self-prescribe what you think community is. That could be a geographical community where you live, or it could be a spatial or an online community, so a space that you have outside of the geographical end of things, or functional space, so where you work, or maybe, I don't know, dating sites. Who knows what your community is? But for sure, what is the biggest issue in your community? It would be really nice if you could enter that into the chat space. And once we get a flavor of those comments, we'll browse through them, and I'm going to call out one or two people, if that's okay, just to give a few words on what the biggest issues are. And again, there's no right or wrong answer to this. It's more, your lived realities that I'm conscious of. So climate change, thank you. Lots coming in there now. So I see a name there that I know well. Tom, you're very welcome. Nice to see you, Tom Roach. Hunger, thank you. Transport and citizen engagement, brilliant. Sarah, thank you. Dara, really interesting. Ignorance and carelessness. Chris, thank you again. The lack of engagement. John, raising awareness of the SDGs. Martin, thank you. Yeah, so just I would encourage you all just to browse through what others have said, not just your own comment. I may not be capturing everything. But maybe if I can ask Pat, if you don't mind, if you could come off mute, if that's okay, and if you could just expand a little bit on the transport and citizen engagement, Pat, if you don't mind.
That's a sort of a near Dublin. Transport is a big issue because people are commuting and it's causing congestion with cars. So trying to get, as an environmentalist, trying to get people to use more public transport is a big issue where I come from. And the citizenship, the debate is in my neck of the woods around the problem that people won't even pay for cutting the grass. There's a lack of citizenship. People have their big houses, but they're not willing to sort of see the need for the common good and whatever. So there's being on a committee to try and get funding from people where they have to pay a small amount each year. They resent doing it, and yet they'll buy their big cars to be able to go outside of the place. It's sort of strange paradoxes.
Thank you for that, Pat. Really, really, strong points. Maybe I can go to Aisling, access to education at all levels. Aisling, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so in our area, there isn't enough school places for the size of the local community at any level, but in particular secondary, and then anybody wanting college would have to commute a considerable distance at expense. So And there's not enough childcare for little people either, which isn't a concern to me personally, but is a huge concern to the community.
That's great, Aisling. Thank you for that. Maybe I can go to Sarah, if that's okay, just about the point you made, Sarah, about raising awareness of sustainability.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, Bobby. Yeah, so it can be a real challenge. So I work at the Rediscovery Centre. We do a lot of education, like getting primary schools interested, not too hard, but adults is a real challenge just to get them to kind of connect it with what's happening in real life. Like they think it sounds great in theory, and then how does it actually work in practice?
Yeah, no, indeed. Thank you for that, Sarah. Maybe Brian, if I could just go to one more, Brian O'Toole, if that's okay.
Sure. Hi, Bobby. Thanks very much indeed. I'm looking forward to this, really, I have to say. One of the problems we find is that SDG 8, if you think of a seesaw, the fulcrum point is the midpoint, which is SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth. We think they should be decoupled. We think you can't have both. They're both competing and contrary. Decent work is a good idea, but constant economic growth is at the expense of the climate, or is at the expense of biodiversity degradation, environmental degradation. It's also at the expense of people. So it negates 2 of the 5 P's straight away. And this constant need for growth in a cost of living crisis is leaving so many more people further behind. So while we're actually chasing our tails with regards to the SDGs, even though we believe wholeheartedly in them. And today, the Irish draft VNR was produced in time for the stakeholder forum next week. So I'm dying to hear how they would look at COVID, cost of living crisis, energy, all of those things as we try to implement the SDGs at the halfway point, when you really should ask, are we halfway achieved? No, not at all. Thanks, Bobby.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Brian. And I know, there's a huge amount of knowledge that you have to share around the SDGs. So I'll be calling on you during this session, Brian, again. But great to see you and to have you here. I'm going to basically just show a website, and this isn't a Development Perspectives website. This is a UN website that I'm just going to share. And I'm going to make just a couple of general comments about the Sustainable Development Goals. And I would just encourage all of you to, if you wish, to go to this website and to find a little bit more about the specific goals that may be of more direct interest to you. First of all, just a few general comments. These were signed off in 2015, and it was a framework that 193 countries came together on. But they didn't come from nowhere, and there was a huge amount of consultation that had gone on for quite some time beforehand. Prior to the Sustainable Development Goals, we had what was known as the Millennium Development Goals, and there was 8 of those, and they went from the year 2000 to 2015. And as those years were ticking on, one of the criticisms of the Millennium Development Goals was that there was some issues that weren't being tackled, that were key to many countries across the world. It was also a clear division between Global South and Global North, which many felt was problematic. The climate crisis was really kind of beginning to be on more people's radars and more organizational radars, even though, of course, for those that are interested, it was around a lot longer, but still, it didn't really figure in the Millennium Development Goals as a major issue. And I suppose what's important to say, and again, I'll be the first to say, and I'll draw attention to 3 problems, as I say, with the Sustainable Development Goals in a moment. But one advantage from an Irish perspective is that there was a co-chairing process involved, and one of them was Ireland. So Ireland and Kenya co-chaired the negotiations around the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, you can imagine to engage with 193 governments at the best of times is problematic. But they actually did a public engagement with 4.5 million people across the world. And I know personally, I was involved with a couple of those back in 2014 at a European level. So I do know there was citizen engagement. I'm also aware that maybe there wasn't enough citizen engagement, and maybe it wasn't to the depth that people would desire. And also that maybe some countries did a better job at that public engagement than others. I think there's before we get to this, to the 17 goals themselves, and you'll have seen these kind of slides before. They range from no poverty for number 1 through to 17 is partnership for the goals. It is important for those of you that might be new to talking about the SDGs is that the numbers are not indicative of a hierarchy. So number 1 is not the most important, 17 is not the least important. In fact, many would argue, depending on your perspective, that the things like, say, gender equality might be key, or maybe some would believe that the climate end of things is the most important, goal 12, or maybe some would believe, if they're involved in education, that goal 4, quality education, is key. Irrespective of your view, I think there is an understanding that these goals interplay, that it's very difficult to deal with any one of the goals without addressing or looking at some of the other goals. So I will get to the goals in a second in case anyone has any individual questions over the meaning of some of the goals, because I don't want to assume that we all have a clear understanding on what each goal is. But what I would say is that Brian has already very well articulated a problem with goal 8, decent work and economic growth. One of the criticisms of the goals is goal 8, and exactly as Brian described, it's this idea of like driving with the handbrake on. That on the one hand, we're trying to achieve certain things, but part of the driving force behind some of those problems is indeed some of the extractivism or some of the damaging ways in which some types of economic growth can occur or accrue. So there is a lot of debate around that goal 8. Another issue around the goals is conflict is not really explicitly looked at. It is in an indirect manner under some of the goals. And you know, I think that it's fair to say that David Donoghue, who was the Irish co-chair of the agreement, when you look at the structure of the United Nations, it's easy to understand that some of the veto powers, and there's 5 veto powers within the United Nations, Russia, the United States, France, UK, and China, and that, you know, none of those countries were willing to see conflict be an explicit mention in the goals. And I think that that is, of course, a huge weakness. I think it's a weakness more generally within the United Nations rather than just the Sustainable Development Goals, because sadly, I think many countries and many interests within many countries benefit from conflict. And I think it's a real missed opportunity not to have conflict more readily and explicitly addressed. But I don't lay the blame for that, though, at the facilitators or co-chairs of the SDGs. I think that's more of a power imbalance within the United Nations itself. And of course, that doesn't justify it, but I think it goes some way to explain why it is the case. I think the other point worth mentioning is around human rights, that there's a distinct lack of mention of human rights. And again, without kind of blaming particular countries, again, some countries were far more willing to see human rights front and center of the Sustainable Development Goals, and others certainly did not want to see human rights be referenced in the way that arguably some would prefer to see. So the likes of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and many countries would have been critical of the SDGs for that reason, and that human rights was kind of, to a certain extent, airbrushed, again, which I think is a real missed opportunity. But even with those imperfections around economic growth, conflict, looking at human rights, I think these goals still are hugely important. And I think that it's very difficult to argue against gender equality. I think it's very difficult to argue against having clean water and sanitation. I think it's very difficult to argue against affordable and clean energy. I think that an awful lot of the goals contain a huge amount of good. While that being said, I don't think the goals are perfection itself. And like everything in life, there is a downside or a dark side. If you're a Star Wars fan, you know, the Darth Vader, it exists in all stories. And I think that's somewhat human. I think that it's very difficult to look at any story without seeing a shadow side. But that doesn't mean I think you dismiss the whole thing. I think there's too much in this that's really worth fighting for, but not in the conflict sense, more in the energy and effort sense. So I suppose before I go on any further, I'd like to just pause there, and feel free to unmute yourself if you wish. I would like to ask, is there any of the 17 goals that you can see on screen that you're a little bit unsure what is meant by it? So again, I just don't want to assume and move on into other areas without asking. Like, is everyone clear on what each goal is and what it's trying to achieve? Without going into massive depth on each of them, there are 169 targets, so each goal is a big area in and of itself. But I'll pause there for a moment and just invite any questions that anyone would have, especially about the meaning of any one of the goals. I'm thinking the silence is golden, that in some way is kind of permission to proceed, but I'll proceed slowly. So if there is any kind of concern about some of the wording of them, then come back to me, if that's okay. Okay, super. So I'll stop sharing that. Yeah, I'll stop sharing that, but just the link will be shared in the slides and stuff afterwards. So you will be able to refer back to those. So I'll go back to the slides that I had. So just bear with me just a moment until I line these up. And I'll just go into slideshow. So yeah, so we covered the first few slides, happy days. And, you know, what are the Sustainable Development Goals? Again, it's a global agreement, but again, non-binding. So it's not legally binding. Countries can sign up or not. And they're to be achieved by 2030. So all of that wonderful vision that we would have is to hopefully be achieved by 2030. One big issue, and this is something that maybe all of you will understand more readily than let's say the usual group that we would work with, and I'll say that for good reason, in the sense that theoretically there are different theories of how development works, and what's really important is that the Sustainable Development Goals adheres to a theory of sustainable development. So that may seem, okay, that's like a no-brainer, but actually most people speaking about the Sustainable Development Goals are not aware of this, that oftentimes there's a misrepresentation of the goals. And oftentimes they're spoken about publicly as if there's kind of three pillars, and that these three pillars are kind of like, you know, equal, they have equal standing, you know, that they kind of like they're three pillars to a stool, and that they all keep the stool, you know, upright. Actually, from a sustainable development point of view, when you look at that as a kind of a theory of development, it's a little bit unfair and a little bit of a misrepresentation, I think. And I think that this wedding cake illustration is far more accurate in understanding those three pillars. So yes, there are three pillars in sustainable development. There's the environmental, or sometimes what's referred to as the biosphere. There's the societal or political, sometimes referred to, and then there's the economic. But if you're adhering to a different development theory, so let's say modernism is a different development theory, you would believe that economics drives essentially, like a rising tide lifts all boats will be something you would hear from somebody who adheres to modernism as a theory of development. Well, from a sustainable development point of view, the economic pillar is important, but it's allowed function, or it's enabled to function once you've got a society that works. So the societal part underpins the economic side of things, and that in turn is underpinned by a thriving and functioning biosphere. And that, I suppose, there's a basic understanding that is sometimes missed, is that if you don't have a functioning biosphere, best of luck with your economy. And that really it's far less important, like, and the basic like understanding of where oxygen comes from plays this out, that like in order to breathe, humans need oxygen, right? And I know this may seem really kind of basic to some, but from a science point of view, like that's really important, that, you know, we need certain levels of oxygen, and that like if our oceans are, you know, not functioning in the way that they currently are, maybe in 30, 40, 50 years, or maybe sooner, then we not only have a problem with like things like melting ice caps and stuff, maybe we've got a problem with oxygen levels. And I suppose, again, some of the physics of this is sometimes missed, that like we need a functioning biosphere to enable a functioning society, to enable a functioning economy. And at the core of Agenda 2030, which is the set of documents that surround the Sustainable Development Goals. Most people haven't read Agenda 2030, the actual set of documents that really gave birth to the goals themselves, because the tiles themselves are one thing. And I understand why people might have criticism with the delivery of the goals, which we'll get to, but the actual underpinning documents are really transformative. And sometimes I think people come to a view of the goals without having read the background documents, and that those background documents are really strong on things like a functioning biosphere. Now, what sometimes doesn't translate then is the model, the framework into action, because you can have a modernist government in a particular state, not naming any in particular, that interpret the goals in a way that they wish to interpret them. And then they deliver them or implement them in a particular way that suits their political agenda. But the actual United Nations Agenda 2030 is really transformative. And again, I think that sometimes it's misrepresented or oversimplified in terms of the tiles themselves. So here are the 17 goals, no poverty, and so on and so forth. Yes, that's a way of publicly engaging with people, because color and simplifying things sometimes work. But there is a huge amount of theory that underpins all of that, which I think is crucial to know. So that's just a small point of the dangers of misrepresentation. And it goes on not just with strange conspiracy theories, but it also goes on politically for particular reasons as well. If anyone again has a comment or a question, feel free to jump in. And it brings us to I suppose some of what's known as the 5 Ps. Brian referenced this earlier on. Oftentimes a shortcut into understanding the Sustainable Development Goals is things like peace, planet, prosperity, people, and partnership. Wonderful, like who doesn't want a world at peace? The planet itself matters. Prosperity for all, people, great, and partnership, and that's lovely. But I think that there is again a kind of a dark side around the 5 Ps, and I think that the SDGs do have huge potential. I would be a big kind of fan of the potential that the SDGs have, and we will look at progress. I'm going to show you a report in a few minutes around the progress that has been made, particularly in an Irish context. But I think there's been a huge amount of procrastination around the Sustainable Development Goals. I think we've postponed them too easily, too readily, not just because of the goals themselves and their ambition, but also because of things like COVID, and also because of things like, say, in an Irish context, housing and homelessness, that we continually come up with ways of, being kind of creatively avoidant, I would say. And it's a great psychological thing that we all suffer from, that we all, creatively avoid things. And again, I would be a big fan of many of the efforts that Ireland is making, but I think it's fair to say that I think, we're missing too many opportunities, and the possibilities that the SDGs presented, I think, are just being missed. And I say that not just from an education point of view, but also from a kind of an activist perspective, or indeed politically. I think there's a huge missed opportunity around the possibilities. So I suppose I'm going to veer into now some of the progress, and Brian talked about the VNR. We can all use kind of words and acronyms, and the VNR is the Voluntary National Report, and Ireland is due to report to the United Nations this year. So there is a lot of analysis being done currently by political actors, governmental actors, but also by civil society. Academic organizations are involved in this as well, of course. So I'd like to show you some research around this in terms of, not what I think around progress, but what is being said about progress in an Irish context. And I'll share that with you in a moment. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'm just going to draw attention now to a report, and it was produced by Social Justice Ireland, which many of you will be familiar with the work of. And again, I'm not going to go into this document in massive depth, but I think it's good from an evidential point of view to show you that opinions are great, and there's space for that, and let's welcome opinion, but also let's look at the evidence behind things. So there is over the last couple of years, an annual report done, and you'll see it there on screen, called Measuring Progress, Sustainable Progress Index 2023. So this is very current. And what it compares Ireland to is what's known as the EU 14. So our best comparators within the EU. And we're ranked 8 out of the 14. Now, again, that might sound that, oh, well, that's not too bad. Actually, there's some positive signs to that 8 out of the 14, because we're going up the ladder rather than down. However, what's also true to say is that the overall performance of the 14 is slipping. So while comparatively we're doing better against some countries, overall the 14 are doing worse. So it's a very mixed bag of evidence. But what I do want to show you is that there are some kind of interesting placings of Ireland. So you'll see here some of the strengths. So Ireland is in the top 5 for just 3 sustainable development goals. And this goes back to, again, some of the points that were made earlier on. One of the goals that Ireland does very well on is education. So goal 4. It does quite well as well on good health and well-being and sustainable cities and communities. I find that last one hard to take because that takes into account housing and homelessness. So again, I'm kind of thinking, really? That's a strength? Like that we're doing well comparatively, hence the problem sometimes with comparisons. Yeah, and so there are some things to keep in mind. But one of the things I'd like to show you is this kind of like the countries that are doing better, and in some cases they're doing substantially better. So, you know, our Nordic friends, no surprise, maybe in some cases, but they are doing very well in some areas. And you see there that Denmark, Sweden is top of the 15. Ireland again is 8 out of the 15. But you know, it's a mixed bag of where we are. But I thought that this was more interesting maybe to you good folk, because when you look at some of the things that maybe would be thought about the SDGs, you might imagine that actually economically we're doing very well. Well, not so, not according to this report. That like really we're kind of like, you see there, we're 9th out of the 15 economically. So like good jobs and economic growth, you know, and again, that's maybe how it's counted. But when it comes to industry, innovation and infrastructure, we're not doing that well. And that's more got to do with the last two, the innovation and infrastructure. And I think public transport is a good example of this. The public transport infrastructure is not great, really. And so that's an example that, you know, even economists would recognize that, yeah, the infrastructure from a public transport point of view, or water infrastructure, or other types of infrastructure like energy infrastructure, that, you know, you can see how the economic end of things here connects directly to the environmental end of things. And then when we go then, and I didn't do the color coding in case anyone thinks I'm a devout Republican. That's not what I did. This isn't how I spend my time. This is taken directly from the document itself. So that's, you see society in the middle in the white. So some we do well on, like quality education, we're the first out of the 15. So better than Finland, better than Austria. And I think that there's a lot of good reasons behind that. Whereas, and this may surprise many of you, zero hunger. Ireland has got a real problem with hunger of some parts of our demographic. So children. And children in some parts of the country suffer with hunger. Bernardo's reckon that in some parts of the state it's 1 in 10. 1 in 10 children don't have enough food nutritionally to really concentrate in school, which I think is quite damning when you think of how wealthy a country Ireland is. On the environment end of things at the bottom, you'll see that again it does well in some places and less so in others. You'll see that some, like clean water and sanitation, doesn't do that well. Again, to some of you, that will be no surprise. While to me, one of the surprising parts of this is SDG 15, life on land. Ireland has got one of the lowest forest coverage, you know, rates. And I was surprised that it was actually middling. I thought it would be far worse. When you think of soil degradation, when you think of forest cover, when you think of land use, I was just a bit surprised that we were 7th out of 14. So again, I suppose this just goes to show that we can have our own blind spots, we can have our own views of the reality of situations, and then sometimes you read documents that challenge your own perspective on things, which of course I think is healthy. But I'm not going to go into massive more detail on the progress, other than Ireland is doing middling, but overall those 14 countries are doing worse. Yeah, so I'll stop sharing that, but again, the link will be provided in the slides. So maybe just to pause there, just to see if there's any questions that any of you might have. And again, you can put it into the chat space if you wish. You're happy enough, it seems. Happy days. This is an interesting group. I'm getting an easy go of it at the moment. I bet you that will change in the next 5 minutes. Let's see. But just to encourage you, if you do. Oh, I see a comment. Let me see. Sorry. Oh yeah, sorry, that was a few minutes ago. So apologies to Eric. I'm only seeing that now. So yeah, so we need degrowth. I mean, many would agree with that, Eric. I don't necessarily disagree. I do think it's an interesting area that I know Green Foundation Ireland are doing a lot of work on. I'm going to come to Claire now. Like, a lot of work has been written by Jason Hickel and many others about the kind of contradictions between the SDGs and growth. So yeah, we'll come back to that in a moment. And thank you, Dara. I'll return to you now. Claire, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, just wondering about the measure that delivers that ranking. Is it against the individual sub-goals within each SDG, or is there, because a lot of them are fairly qualitative, but as well as look at them. Yeah, how does that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, like anything that gives us, tabular results or statistical analysis, is like, okay, well, what's the methodology? Where did that come from? In the document itself, there is an academic partner involved, I should say, that like Social Justice Ireland have led the way, but they have involved academics in the writing of it. So it's quite a robust piece, but I would say that they have, and this is going to sound disparaging, and I don't mean it to be, but they've kind of somewhat cherry picked around the indicators that they've used. So they haven't used all of the indicators that are outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think, in fairness to them, that's huge. Like, the data sets that are in that are massive. So what they've done is that they've looked at a kind of like, a meta-analysis of some of the data that's out there, and they've picked certain indicators that they've honed in on more, and like that they are upfront about it in the methodology section of that report. So yeah, I mean, it is tricky. And I mean, one of the things that's difficult as well during this VNR process that the United Nations have, that I mentioned Ireland is reporting to this year, not only is it voluntary in terms of them reporting, it's also kind of quite voluntary in terms of what they choose to measure in order to present. Now, there is a civil society section to that report, which is a bit more critical, but, yeah, that the reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, generally speaking, is a bit of a weakness. It should say as well, in Ireland, the Central Statistics Office, who have a very good reputation, they do cover some of the data that's represented in the document from Social Justice Ireland, but not all. So there's a huge amount of data coming from other sources that sometimes you need to be skeptical of. And Dara, I see there, yeah, ranking 7th on land may just mean the average is very poor. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the relatives comparison side of things is sliding. So yeah, I mentioned that earlier on, and Sarah agrees with Dara, the same with life underwater. I don't disagree with that. Yeah, however, it's probably fair to say that when governments and states are talking to each other about their performance, of course they'll say, well, we're not doing that bad because X, Y, or Z is doing worse. Well, that's not always a great thing, eh? I mean, we know that, but But as I say, there are some sets of data that show Ireland in a very favourable light. Like, you know, when I'm speaking about education, the OECD have independent data that kind of backs that view up, that they would say, well, actually, on the education end of things, Ireland is, you know, really good at lots of things. So, you know, again, we have to be careful of our views and opinions and where we're getting it from and what's the evidential backing to that. Okay, so let's see, we're going to move on if you don't mind. I'll keep an eye on the time. I know that that all of you no doubt have evening gardening plans before bed. So I'm going to just go back to our slides. And I wanted to show you a kind of maybe a strange example, but I thought an interesting example nonetheless. So bear with me a second. Yeah. So, I mean, we can all look at, you know, what the government does. And I think there's a danger in that, because goal 17 is very much around partnership for the goals. And I think it's a case of like, okay, well, what can I do? What can we do? And I know sometimes there is a criticism of the Sustainable Development Goals that boils it down to individual actions too much. There is a structural and systemic part to the Sustainable Development Goals that I would be the first to draw attention to, and realize that, yeah, there is a huge amount that the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach, all of the political parties, government can do. There's a huge amount. There's also a huge amount local government can do. There's a huge amount the universities can do. There's a huge amount the private sector can do. There's a huge amount that civil society actors can do. There's a huge amount for all of us to do. And I'm just showing this as an example, you know, warts and all, of an interesting example from Fingal PPN. So the reason I mentioned this again is I don't have any direct connection to Fingal PPN, but I think it's a sign that people are making in some spaces a genuine effort. And here we have, you know, something that the PPN in Fingal did in 2017, 2018. What they tried to do was align their strategy to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think credit to them, lots of other local authorities and county development plans are beginning to go that way. And again, look, you know, that may be too late, according to some. But again, to go back to the point I made at the start, I for one would believe that the more anyone takes action on gender equality, the better. So if it's a little bit delayed, okay, better than not at all. So like, I think it is a case that we should encourage more action quicker. Let's speed it up and let's do more on a systemic level, but also give credit where credit is due. And I think in this case, you'll see here that they took 17 actions. Now, the reason, again, I'm highlighting it is that none of the actions are actually groundbreakingly, you know, new. They're not looking for a massive amount of money. They're trying to kind of like align an awful lot of what they do to the Sustainable Development Goals, and trying to bring their members with them doing that. So you'll see the first one. And again, you know, you could argue that maybe there's a little bit of SDG washing in this. I'd like to think that maybe there is a little bit, but I think the majority of this is coming from a really good place. That, like, I think they are trying to grow the PPN membership in a planned and sustainable way, and linking that to sustainable communities. The second action, the third action, the fourth action, you know, you see there that, like, under action 5, showcase our achievements. Now, what would they mean by that? Well, like, one of the things that they do is to try to celebrate active citizens in Fingal, which I think is really interesting, because I think, again, too often we can talk about those that are not doing anything, but look at the amount of wonderful people and groups and organizations that are doing great stuff, many of whom you are. You know, that you do great stuff, no doubt, individually as part of your work, part of your organizations. And sometimes by acknowledging that, it gives you more energy to do more, rather than look to where we don't have things. And I think it's worth really kind of thinking about. And you see there, action 7, work closely with Fingal County Council to communicate to citizens. Again, that's interesting. I think it connects very strongly to the last 2 goals. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. I think it's very difficult to have strong local or national government without a strong citizenry. That you need a strong citizenry to kind of hold, you know, duty bearers to account. And I think that this is a really good example of the PPN not going to, okay, well, we need the PPN to connect to the county council. And of course, that should be the same arguably with every PPN. but partnership for the goals. I think we need to realize that we do need to do more work together. Action 12, just as an example, develop the social inclusion pillar. When we talk explicitly about goal 10 of the SDGs, reducing inequalities, there are some parts of the demographic that are often left behind. So, you know, one of the subtexts of the SDGs is leave no one behind. Well, sadly, an awful lot of people are being left behind in many ways. And I think that this is an interesting one, that oftentimes the inclusion pillar of PPNs, they try to be inclusive. So we look at maybe those with a migration background, those maybe with disability challenges, those arguably, say, for instance, with health issues, you know, and we look at ways of trying to really include and involve, and not in a tokenistic way, but to value the humanity of all of us, and to really cherish that. So I think this is an interesting example. I'm not trying to, as I said, I'm not directly involved in the Fingal PPN. I just think it's an interesting example of what an entity does in terms of trying to connect its work to the Sustainable Development Goals, and, you know, make contributions in an interesting and positive way. There was only one other thing I wanted to really show you, and I'll stop for questions, and that's very much around resources. Like there's tons of resources out there about the Sustainable Development Goals, and I am going to share just the ones that I know best. And I'm going to share just a page on screen, and you'll see at the very top, that's from the organization that I work with, Development Perspectives. And underneath that, you'll see there, CELTA is a program within Development Perspectives. And you've got a number of resources: stepping stones for the Sustainable Development Goals, understanding the Sustainable Development Goals. And then underneath that, again, on our website, there's 17 information packs, one on each goal, that you can download and look at. There's lots of video links, there's lots of up-to-date articles, and you can bring yourself up to speed, or those that you work with, if you wish to. So there's no end of resources that are out there for you to deepen your knowledge and analysis and work around the Sustainable Development Goals. Lots of food for thought there in those resources. And if you wish, if anyone wants me to, I can link to other organizations' resources, because there's huge amount of resources out there by other organizations. So I'll stop there, Claire, if that's okay, and just really kind of invite as many comments or questions as the group wish.
Thank you so much, Bobby. That was a really excellent overview of the SDGs and where we are. I can see a few questions come in, so do please keep adding them in, or if you want to unmute yourself and turn your video on, please do that as well. This one just there from Dara, Bobby.
Yeah, I see that from Dara. It's a great point, Dara. Well, so there's two answers to this, maybe, is that, like, what comes next is being discussed at UN level, and of course at national level in countries around the world. You know, it's too early to say exactly what will happen yet, because the United Nations will make those decisions in the next couple of years. One kind of area of dialogue that's happening is about continuing the SDGs. Now, some would say that's a real sign that things are not going well. So we're just going to extend the 2015 to 2030 out to maybe 2035 or to 2040. Look, I don't know really is the simple answer what comes next. I do think what should come next in the immediate term is far more activity on what we have, at least up until 25, 26, and then let's turn our attention to what's beyond that. But, you know, I'm not at that pay grade, Dara, so yeah. And I would agree, I hope the wheels are not reinvented. I see Brian wanted to jump in, so please do, Brian.
Thanks a million, Bobby. I've learned so much already this evening, but I'm just wondering if you had the chance to advise the government for the forthcoming high-level political forum and for the UNGA, where we have 2 days, and Ireland again is co-facilitating, is there any specific advice you might give them that would move things along? We heard a guy who apparently has a role in the UNGA in September, and he said Ireland is being invited because when Ireland turns up at the table, they don't just try and push their own agenda. They try and bring everybody with them. So I thought that was a nice way of saying we're quite a nice nation, shall we say. But what advice might you give the government going forward with 2 chances? Thanks, Bobby.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great, it's a great question and a hard question. And wouldn't I love to be in that position? God, if they were to ask for advice, wow, I'd charge for it. That would be for the first step. But quite honestly, I think one of the things that Ireland has really underutilized is one or two of its key strengths. And so, first of all, around the education space, it is such a shame that in an Irish context, when we saw the performance of Ireland in terms of the education, that we have such a low public awareness of the SDGs in Ireland. I do not understand why they didn't go after that as an easy win, you know, to begin with, within the board, you know, within this kind of island, that like we could have really done that. We have a small population. Like we our rates of public awareness are demoralizingly low, and like that was an easy win. So one of the things I would say to government, if given that space, is like, go after this big time in next year, and it'll be easily done with a population that we have. If we put the wheels in motion, we could really achieve far more penetration around the awareness of the Sustainable Development Goals than there are in Finland. Finland would be the best in this regard. You're talking about 70 or 80% of the population are not only aware of the SDGs, can talk to you about them. You know, we did a piece of research a couple of years back, and most of the people we interviewed on a Vox Pop kind of were confusing them with STDs, which says it all really of where we're at in terms of public awareness. That being said, the second national implementation plan that was out last year, it does show a positive trend, but the trend is really slow. So there has been an increase in public awareness of the goals, but it's being paralyzingly slow. The second thing I would really advise government on, if given their ear, is to use the brilliant reputation that it has around food security, and it won't because of particular interest groups, but to change the narrative around food and agriculture internationally. It could easily do that, to really look towards a much more sustainable method of food production, because it specializes in that from a diplomacy point of view. One of the first countries that any big global institutional framework goes to around famines, around food, around agriculture is Ireland. And it could really change the discussion there, but it's chosen not to. They would be the two things that I'd love to see Ireland do far more on. I see John has mentioned, no problem. I see John has mentioned, so adult and further education. I mean, in just to let you know, John, that SAILTA, the organizer, or the program I mentioned, SAILTA is a strategic partnership with Irish Aid to embed global citizenship education within the adult and community education sector. And it's a massive sector. I mean, just to give you an idea, in Cork Education and Training Board, they've 1,300 staff. That's just one ETB. There's 16 ETBs. There's 31 or 32 PPNs, and we're trying to engage with PPNs all the time. You're right, I think they should be incorporated far more, but it's a very difficult job to get stakeholders on board that mission. But the fight goes on. We are trying our best. So if you have any ideas, John, do let me know by email. I'll take your idea. I will reference you though, don't worry, I won't steal the ideas. Okay, so I'm just conscious of time. There's 1 or 2 minutes left. Claire, over to you.
I was just wondering, I know that you go around the country talking to community groups about SDGs, and apart from the confusion with STDs, what else are you picking up, and even are there trends that I suppose mirror, you know, economic changes as well, or what do you find people are more confused about or more knowledgeable about over time?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things, Claire, that's still a little frustrating is that when you go to, let's say, county development plans, so when you're speaking to councillors around county development plans, a lot of them would still be of the view that if your economy locally is working well, that everything else just fits into place. And that's frustrating, because it's a great story, it's just that it's fictional. So like, great stories, of course, are powerful, and it's not it's the belief behind them that matters. And so I still think we have a lot of work to do collectively to change not just minds, but hearts around some of these issues. The other thing that would give me real though cause for a little bit of positivity is around the amount of younger people that are speaking around climate change. I mean, it is noticeable that anytime we're in, let's say, a space where the majority of the group is under the age of 25, they're far more active and animated about this issue than I would have seen, say, 10, 15 years ago, that they really kind of are a little bit fed up, I think, a little bit kind of like, you know, can you move aside if you're not going to do anything about this? So I think there's an element of a generational shift, I think, you know, but I don't want to overstate that, because maybe they're just the groups that we're working with because they are interested, you know. And I think on the other hand, there is still this resistance at councillor level on local authorities across the country to recognise that the biosphere, the social political end of things, that they need to be addressed in the county development plans as well. Okay, so Sarah agrees. Happy days, Sarah. Thank you. I'm glad there's a little bit of agreement there. I'm going to hand back to Claire, but can I do two things? First of all, can I thank all of you, because I know it is a sunny evening and, you know, Man United didn't kick off till 8, so I'm a happy camper. I'm okay with that. But I do want to thank you for showing up. And I would just urge all of you, if you wish, to find out more about the SDGs, to get in touch and to take action to try to do your bit through the work that you do. So just to really thank the Green Foundation Ireland for the opportunity to be here. Hand back to Claire.
Thank you so much, Bobby. And we will circulate the slides afterwards and this recording, and it's developmentperspectives.ie, if I'm right, your website in the meantime, if you're curious to find out more. Just to recognise one active citizen who works away behind the scenes organising all of these events for Green Foundation Ireland and publicising them and doing the hard slog, getting information out of people beforehand, is Anne O'Connor, who's on the call. And thank you so much, Anne, who works for GFI. And there you are. Hi, Anne. And with that, unless there's anything else, yeah, there will be an email circulated with the recording and it will go up on our website, greenfoundationireland.ie. So thank you so much, Bobby, for your time, and for everyone for joining the call. Thank you.